bouncer said my military ID was fake until the bar owner saw the name and started crying. The bar was called Fallback, a dive on the edge of Charleston with peeling paint and a neon sign that flickered like a dying heartbeat. I'd driven 3 hours to get here, following an address I'd found in my brother's belongings after the funeral. Austin had been dead for 6 months, and I was still finding pieces of his life I didn't understand. This place was one of them. A matchbook with the name scrawled on the back in his handwriting, tucked inside a book about combat trauma he'd never mentioned reading. I needed to know why this place mattered to him. I needed to understand the brother I'd apparently never really known. The parking lot was mostly empty on this Wednesday evening. Just a few motorcycles and beat-up trucks scattered across the cracked asphalt. I locked my car and walked toward the entrance, my brother's dog tags hanging around my neck under my shirt, where I'd worn them every day since the funeral. The bouncer was massive, 6'5" easily, with arms like tree trunks and a beard that covered half his face. He sat on a stool by the door, scrolling through his phone with one hand while the other rested on his knee. When I approached, he looked up and sized me up in that way security does, making instant calculations about threat level and likelihood of causing problems. I'm 6 feet and weigh about 170 pounds, lean from my Marine Corps training, but not particularly intimidating compared to this guy. He nodded at me to come forward and asked for my ID in a voice that sounded like gravel grinding. I pulled out my military ID card, the one that identified me as Sergeant Kyle Osman, United States Marine Corps, currently on authorized leave. He took it and held it up to the light, squinting at the photo and then at my face. Then his expression changed, hardening into something suspicious and hostile. "This is fake," he said flatly, handing the card back to me. I stared at him, confused. It wasn't fake. It was a legitimate military ID issued by the Department of Defense with all the proper security features and holograms. I told him it was real, and he could verify it if he needed to. He shook his head and crossed his arms, his biceps straining against his shirt sleeves. He said he'd seen enough fake IDs to know one when he saw it, and mine was definitely fake. The photo looked photoshopped, and the card felt wrong in his hand. He told me to leave before he called the cops for fraud and impersonating a service member. My face got hot with anger and embarrassment. A few people had stopped outside to watch the confrontation, curious about the commotion. I insisted again that my ID was real, that I was actually in the Marines, that this was absurd. The bouncer stood up to his full height, towering over me by several inches, and said if I didn't leave immediately, he'd physically remove me from the property. I was about to argue more when the front door of the bar opened and a man stepped out, probably in his early 50s, with gray hair and weathered skin that spoke of too many years in the sun. He wore jeans and a faded military t-shirt and moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had taken damage and learned to compensate. He asked what the problem was, and the bouncer explained that I was trying to use a fake military ID to get in. The older man asked to see the ID, and the bouncer handed it over with a satisfied expression, like he was handing evidence to a judge. The man held the card under the exterior light and read it carefully. Then he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite parse, something between confusion and recognition. He asked my name, and I told him Kyle Osman. He went very still, his eyes locked on my face. Then he asked if I was related to Austin Osman. The sound of my brother's name from a stranger's mouth hit me like a physical blow. I nodded and said Austin was my brother, that he died 6 months ago. The man's face crumpled, his eyes filling with tears that he didn't bother to hide. He made a sound that was half sob, half exhale, and leaned against the doorframe like his legs wouldn't hold him. The bouncer looked alarmed, reaching out to steady him, but the man waved him off. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and told the bouncer that my ID was real and I was welcome here any time. That in fact, I should never have to pay for a drink in this establishment ever again. The bouncer started to protest, but the man cut him off sharply, saying he owned this bar and his word was final. Then he looked at me with such raw grief in his expression that I felt my own eyes start to burn. He introduced himself as Derek Holloway and asked if I'd come inside so he could talk to me about Austin. I followed him into the dim interior of Fallback, my heart pounding with questions I didn't know how to ask. Inside, the bar was exactly what you'd expect from the exterior. Dark wood, sticky floors, a long bar with mismatched stools, pool table in the back with torn felt, and walls covered in military memorabilia. Photos of service members in various uniforms, unit patches, challenge coins behind glass, a folded flag in a case above the bar. Derek led me to a booth in the corner away from the handful of other patrons and gestured for me to sit. He went behind the bar and poured 2 whiskeys, neat, and brought them back to the table. He set one in front of me and raised his own glass in a silent toast before downing it in one swallow. I sipped mine, the burn familiar from the nights after Austin's funeral, when I'd tried to drink away the confusion and guilt. Derek sat across from me and studied my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. He said I looked like Austin. Same dark eyes and sharp features, same way of holding tension in my shoulders. I told him I got that comparison a lot growing up, that people always said we could be twins even though Austin was 2 years older. Derek asked how Austin died, and I gave him the official story. Suicide. Austin had hanged himself in his apartment 3 days before anyone found him. No note, no warning signs that anyone noticed, just gone. The therapist at the VA had talked about delayed combat trauma and adjustment disorders, and how sometimes veterans struggled years after coming home. My parents had accepted that explanation because it was easier than questioning it, but I'd never believed it. Austin had been doing well. He'd been going to school, working part-time, seeing friends. He'd seemed happier in the months before his death than he had in years. Something about the suicide narrative didn't fit, and I'd been quietly investigating on my own, trying to understand what really happened. Derek listened to my explanation, and when I finished, he said something that made my blood run cold. Austin didn't kill himself. Austin was murdered, and Derek knew who did it. I sat frozen in that booth, Derek's words echoing in my head. I asked him what he meant, and he leaned forward, his voice dropping low, even though we were the only people in this corner. He said Austin had come to this bar regularly for about a year before his death, usually once or twice a week. Derek was a Marine Corps veteran himself, had done 3 tours in Iraq, and he'd opened Fallback specifically as a place where veterans could come without judgment or questions. Austin had been drawn to the place because it felt safe, because Derek understood things civilians couldn't. Over those months, Austin had opened up to Derek about what happened during his deployment, things he'd never told anyone else, including his family, things that had gotten him into serious trouble with people who didn't want those stories told. Derek said Austin had witnessed something during his time in Afghanistan that shouldn't have happened, something involving his commanding officer and civilian contractors. Austin had reported it through official channels, and instead of being protected as a whistleblower, he'd been retaliated against. I remembered Austin coming home from deployment changed. He'd always been outgoing and confident, but after Afghanistan, he'd become withdrawn and paranoid. He'd talked about problems with his command, but never gave details, just vague references to being targeted and isolated. I'd assumed it was standard military politics, personality conflicts with superiors. I'd never imagined it was something serious enough to get him killed. Derek continued his story, explaining that Austin had collected evidence of what he'd seen, photos, documents, recorded conversations. He'd been planning to take everything to a journalist who specialized in military corruption cases. But 3 weeks before his scheduled meeting with that journalist, Austin died. Derek had tried to get the police to investigate it as a murder, but they'd dismissed him as a conspiracy theorist. The evidence at the scene clearly indicated suicide, and there was no reason to suspect foul play. Case closed. Derek had been carrying the guilt and knowledge for 6 months, wondering if he should have done more to protect Austin. I asked what Austin had witnessed, and Derek's jaw tightened. He said Austin's unit had been working with a private military contractor called Sentinel Defense on a logistics operation in Kandahar province. The contractor was supposed to be transporting supplies, but Austin had discovered they were actually running an illegal smuggling operation, moving heroin and antiquities out of Afghanistan and selling them to international buyers. Austin's commanding officer, a major named Griffith, was getting kickbacks from Sentinel to look the other way. When Austin tried to report it, Griffith had him reassigned to increasingly dangerous positions, essentially trying to get him killed in combat. When that didn't work, and Austin survived his deployment, Griffith had used his connections to destroy Austin's military career. Austin was given a less than honorable discharge on false charges of insubordination and drug use, charges Austin had fought and lost because the system was rigged against him. The whiskey in my stomach turned sour. I'd known Austin's discharge wasn't honorable, but he'd never explained why. He just said there were problems with his command and it was complicated. My parents had been ashamed and confused, unable to reconcile their patriotic pride with their son's apparent failure. Austin had carried that shame alone, unable to defend himself without exposing everything, and then he died before he could make anyone listen. I asked Derek if he had any of Austin's evidence, and he shook his head. He said Austin had kept everything in a storage unit, and only Derek knew the location. After Austin's death, Derek had gone to check on it, but found the unit had been broken into and completely emptied. Someone had known exactly where to look. Derek believed Griffith or Sentinel had been monitoring Austin even after his discharge, had discovered his plans to go public, and had staged his suicide to silence him permanently. I felt rage building in my chest, hot and sharp. My brother hadn't killed himself. He'd been murdered for trying to do the right thing, for trying to expose corruption. And no one had investigated because it was easier to write him off as another troubled veteran who couldn't handle civilian life. I asked Derek why he hadn't done more, why he hadn't screamed this from the rooftops until someone listened. His face showed the weight of that question, the guilt he'd been carrying. He said he had tried. He'd contacted the journalist Austin was supposed to meet and told them everything he knew. The journalist had started investigating, but 2 months later published a story that completely exonerated Griffith and Sentinel, calling the allegations baseless conspiracy theories from disgruntled former service members. Derek suspected the journalist had been paid off or threatened. He'd tried going to Austin's congressional representative, but got stonewalled by staff who wouldn't even pass along his messages. He'd posted about it online but gotten buried under accusations of stolen valor and attention-seeking. I asked if he still had any evidence, anything at all that could prove what he was saying. Derek reached into his pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. He said before Austin's storage unit was emptied, he'd given Derek one thing for safekeeping: a single video file, the most damning piece of evidence Austin had collected. Derek had kept it hidden for 6 months, too afraid to do anything with it but unable to destroy it. He handed me the drive and said if I wanted the truth about what happened to my brother, it was all there, but he warned me that watching it would change everything. Once I knew what was on that drive, I'd have to decide what to do with the information, and that decision could put me in the same danger that killed Austin. I closed my hand around the USB drive, feeling the weight of it, and told Derek I needed to know. Whatever was on this drive, I needed to see it. Derek led me to a small office behind the bar, cramped and cluttered with paperwork and boxes. He had an old laptop on the desk, and he opened it, gesturing for me to sit. He said he'd leave me alone to watch because he couldn't handle seeing it again. Then he walked out and closed the door. I plugged in the USB drive with shaking hands. There was only one file, dated 2 months before Austin's death. I clicked play and my brother's face filled the screen. He was sitting in what looked like a cheap hotel room, the camera propped on something to keep it steady. He looked thin and tired, dark circles under his eyes, but his voice was clear and determined. He stated his name, rank, and service dates, then said he was making this recording because he feared for his life and wanted to ensure his testimony survived even if he didn't. My throat closed up, hearing him acknowledge the danger he was in. Austin spent the next 40 minutes detailing everything he'd witnessed. He showed documents on screen, supply manifests that didn't match actual deliveries, financial records showing money transfers between Sentinel Defense and offshore accounts connected to Major Griffith, photos of Sentinel personnel loading unmarked cargo onto military transport vehicles. He showed emails where Griffith explicitly ordered Austin to ignore discrepancies and stay quiet. Austin explained how he'd tried to report through proper channels and been shut down at every level. He described the retaliation, the dangerous assignments, the false accusations, the discharge proceedings, where he wasn't allowed to present evidence in his defense. He named names, provided dates and locations, built an airtight case against everyone involved. At the end of the video, Austin looked directly at the camera and said, "If anything happened to him, if he died in any circumstances that seemed suspicious, this recording should be considered his testimony that he was murdered to protect a criminal conspiracy." I sat in that office with tears streaming down my face, watching my brother's recorded face predict his own death. He'd known they were going to kill him, and he'd tried to protect himself the only way he could, by documenting everything. But it hadn't been enough. They'd killed him anyway and made it look like suicide, and no one had questioned it because broken veterans killed themselves all the time. It was expected. It was tragic, but understandable, and the people responsible had gotten away with it completely. I ejected the USB drive and sat there trying to steady my breathing. I knew what I had to do. I had to finish what Austin started. I had to make sure his testimony reached people who couldn't be bought or threatened. I had to get justice for my brother, even if it meant putting myself at risk. When I came out of the office, Derek was behind the bar talking to a woman I hadn't seen before. She was maybe 30, with short blonde hair and sharp eyes, wearing cargo pants and a jacket despite the warm evening. Derek introduced her as Simone Cross, said she was former Army intelligence, and now worked as a private investigator specializing in military fraud cases. He'd called her while I was watching the video because he thought I'd need help with what came next. Simone looked me over with an assessing gaze and asked if I understood the danger of what I was holding. I said I understood and I didn't care. These people murdered my brother, and I was going to make them pay. Simone nodded slowly and said if I was serious, she'd help me. But we needed to be smart about it. Going to traditional media wouldn't work because they could be bought off like the journalist Austin tried to use. Going to military authorities wouldn't work because Griffith had connections throughout the chain of command. Simone said our best option was to go directly to the Department of Defense Inspector General's office, which had independent authority to investigate military corruption. But we needed more than just Austin's video. We needed corroborating evidence and preferably additional witnesses. She asked if I knew anything about Austin's unit, anyone he'd served with who might have seen the same things. I thought back to Austin's funeral, trying to remember who'd attended. There had been a few guys from his unit, awkward and uncomfortable, not staying long. One name stuck out because Austin had mentioned him several times. Leo Vance, his closest friend from deployment. They'd joined up together and gone through training together. If anyone else knew about the Sentinel operation, it would be Leo. I told Simone his name and she pulled out her phone, typing rapidly. Within 2 minutes, she'd found Leo's current location through military databases she apparently still had access to. He was living 3 states away, honorably discharged 2 years ago, working as a mechanic. Simone said we should visit Leo tomorrow and see if he'd talk to us. If he'd witnessed the same things Austin had, his testimony combined with Austin's video would be much harder to dismiss. I agreed immediately, already mentally rearranging my schedule. Derek offered to come with us, said he owed it to Austin to see this through. Simone nodded and started making plans. coordinating travel and preparing questions. I sat at the bar feeling like I'd stepped into a different reality. 6 hours ago, I'd been a Marine sergeant on leave, grieving my brother and trying to understand his death. Now I was part of an investigation into military corruption and murder. The bartender, a younger guy with tattoo sleeves, brought me water without being asked and gave me a sympathetic look. Derek told me the bar was a safe place and I could stay as long as I needed. People started arriving for the evening crowd, mostly veterans based on their bearing and the way they greeted Derek. This was a community, I realized, a refuge for people the system had chewed up and spit out. We left early the next morning, driving north in Simone's SUV. Derek sat in back while Simone drove and I navigated using directions from her phone. The drive took most of the day with stops for gas and food. Simone used the time to brief me on interview techniques, how to approach someone who might be traumatized or paranoid, how to build trust quickly. She said Leo might refuse to talk to us, might even be hostile if he thought we were stirring up trouble that could affect his own life. Veterans who'd been burned by the system learned to keep their heads down. We needed to convince him that speaking up mattered more than staying safe. I thought about Austin's video, the resignation in his face when he acknowledged he might die. Austin had decided truth mattered more than safety. I had to believe Leo would make the same choice if we gave him the opportunity. Leo's address led us to a small house in a working-class neighborhood, neat but worn down. An old truck sat in the driveway with the hood propped open, tools scattered on the ground around it. We parked on the street and walked to the front door. Simone knocked, and we waited. After a minute, the door opened and a man appeared, mid-30s with a beard and wary eyes. Leo Vance, based on the photo Simone had shown me from his service record. His gaze moved between the three of us, stopping on my face. He asked if he could help us, and his voice had that flat affect of someone expecting trouble. I introduced myself as Austin Osman's brother, and his expression shifted immediately, recognition and pain flashing across his features. He said Austin's name quietly, almost reverently, then asked what we wanted. I told him we knew Austin didn't kill himself. We knew about Griffith and Sentinel, and we were building a case. Leo's face went pale and he started to close the door, but Derek stepped forward and said we had Austin's testimony on video. That stopped Leo cold. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, visibly struggling with himself. Then he stepped back and gestured for us to come inside. The house was sparse but clean, decorated with military photos and a few personal items. Leo offered us drinks with shaking hands, and we sat in his living room, the tension thick enough to cut. I pulled out my laptop and asked if he was willing to watch Austin's video. Leo nodded tightly, and I set up the playback. For the next 40 minutes, we sat in silence while Austin's recorded testimony filled the room. Leo watched with his jaw clenched and tears running down his face. When it ended, he sat back and covered his eyes with his hands. He said he'd been waiting 6 months for someone to figure it out, for someone to realize Austin wouldn't have killed himself. He'd known immediately when he heard about Austin's death that it wasn't suicide. But he'd been too afraid to say anything because he'd received threats himself after Austin's discharge. Leo said he'd witnessed the same things Austin had, seen Sentinel personnel loading drugs and stolen artifacts onto military transports. He'd been present for conversations where Griffith explicitly coordinated with Sentinel's operations manager. When Austin started asking questions, Leo had backed him up, confirming what he'd seen. That made Leo a target too. After Austin's discharge, Leo received an anonymous message telling him to keep quiet or end up like his friend. The message included photos of Leo's family, his parents and younger sister, with their addresses listed. The threat was clear. If Leo talked, people he loved would be hurt. So he'd stayed silent even when Austin died, hating himself, but too terrified to risk his family's safety. Now he looked at the three of us with something like desperate hope and asked if we really thought we could make anyone pay for what they did. Simone said if Leo was willing to testify and provide his own evidence, we had a real chance. The Inspector General's office couldn't ignore 2 service members making the same allegations with documented proof. Leo stood up and walked to a closet, pulling down a box from the top shelf. Inside were files and photos, his own collection of evidence. He said he'd kept everything even though he'd been too scared to use it, some part of him hoping someone would eventually come asking. He'd documented the same discrepancies Austin had seen, taken his own photos of suspicious cargo, saved emails that showed the corrupt coordination. His evidence combined with Austin's would be overwhelming. Simone went through the files methodically, photographing each document with her phone. She said this was exactly what we needed, that Leo's active duty service and honorable discharge would make his testimony harder to dismiss than Austin's. Derek asked Leo about other members of their unit, anyone else who might have seen something. Leo named 3 others, but said 2 were still active duty and would never talk for fear of their careers. The third, a guy named Caleb Brennan, had also been discharged under questionable circumstances after supporting Austin's initial reports. We spent the next several hours at Leo's house building a comprehensive case file. Simone organized everything systematically, creating timelines and documentation chains. She explained that we needed to present this to the Inspector General's office in person, not through email or mail, where it could be intercepted or ignored. She had a contact in that office, someone she trusted from her Army intelligence days, who would ensure our evidence was seen by people with actual authority to investigate. But we needed to move fast. If Griffith or Sentinel learned we were asking questions, they'd take action to protect themselves. I asked Leo if he'd be willing to come with us to Washington, D.C. to present his testimony directly. He hesitated, fear and determination warring on his face. Then he looked at Austin's photo on my laptop screen and nodded. He said he owed Austin that much. He'd failed to speak up when it mattered, and Austin had died because of it. He wouldn't make that mistake again. The drive to Washington took 2 days with overnight stops. We used the time to prepare our presentation, anticipating questions and potential challenges. Simone coached Leo and me on how to stay calm under pressure, how to stick to facts without getting emotional, even though the subject was deeply personal. Derek spent hours on the phone calling other veterans he knew, trying to find anyone else who had information about Sentinel Defense and their operations. By the time we reached D.C., we had a 20-page summary document with hundreds of pages of supporting evidence, 2 eyewitness testimonies, and video documentation. Simone's contact, a senior special agent named Forrest Yates, agreed to meet us at the Inspector General's office early on a Friday morning before the building got busy. We arrived at dawn, all of us exhausted and wired, carrying our evidence in 3 separate bags in case anyone tried to take it all at once. Forrest met us in the lobby, a black man in his 50s with the bearing of someone who'd spent decades navigating military bureaucracy. He scanned our group with sharp eyes and gestured for us to follow him to a secure conference room. Once we were inside with the door closed, he asked us to explain why we'd requested an emergency meeting. Simone laid out the entire case methodically, starting with Austin's death and working backward through the evidence of his murder, Griffith's corruption, and Sentinel's smuggling operation. She presented documents in careful order, building the narrative step by step. When she finished the overview, Forrest asked Leo and me to provide our testimonies. Leo went first, his voice shaking but clear, describing everything he'd witnessed during his deployment. I went next, explaining my investigation into Austin's death and how I discovered Derek and the video. Forrest listened without interrupting, taking notes occasionally, his expression unreadable. When we finished, Forrest sat back and looked at the mountain of evidence we'd presented. He said this was the most comprehensive case of contractor fraud and command corruption he'd seen in 15 years at the IG's office. The evidence was substantial and credible, but he needed to warn us about what would happen next. Opening an investigation of this scale would trigger immediate response from the people implicated. Griffith would lawyer up. Sentinel would use their political connections to apply pressure. There would be attempts to discredit us, to paint Austin as mentally unstable and Leo as vindictive. My own military career could be targeted. Forrest looked directly at me and asked if I was prepared for the personal cost of pursuing this. I thought about Austin's face in that video, about the resignation in his voice when he said he expected to be killed. I told Forrest I didn't care what it cost me. These people murdered my brother, and I'd burn my own career to the ground if it meant getting them justice. Forrest nodded slowly and said he'd open an official investigation immediately. He'd assign a team to verify our evidence and interview additional witnesses. He'd issue preservation orders to prevent destruction of documents, and he'd coordinate with the Justice Department since this involved potential criminal charges beyond military jurisdiction. He warned us it would take time, probably months, and we needed to be patient. In the meantime, we should be extremely careful. The people we were accusing had already killed once to protect their operation. They wouldn't hesitate to do it again. He gave each of us his personal cell number and said to call immediately if we noticed anything suspicious or felt threatened. We left that conference room feeling a mixture of relief and terror. We'd done it. We'd gotten the investigation started. Now we had to survive long enough to see it through. The first attempt came 3 weeks later. I was back at my duty station, trying to focus on my regular work while the investigation proceeded in the background. Late one evening, I was driving home from base when I noticed a car following me, staying exactly 2 car lengths behind through multiple turns. My training kicked in, and I started taking evasive maneuvers, turning randomly and watching to see if the car matched my movements. It did. When I pulled into a well-lit gas station, the car drove past, but I got a glimpse of the driver. Military-age male, no distinguishing features, professional bearing. I called Forrest immediately, and he told me to stay at the gas station until he could arrange for local police to provide escort. While I waited, I received a text from an unknown number. "Stop asking questions or you'll join your brother." The threat was explicit and terrifying. Forrest's team traced the message to a burner phone purchased with cash, untraceable, but it confirmed we were on the right track. Someone was scared enough to threaten me. Leo received similar threats, more targeted and personal. Someone vandalized his truck and left a note saying they knew where his sister worked. Derek's bar was broken into and trashed, though nothing was stolen. Simone, with her intelligence background, was harder to intimidate, but she reported being followed multiple times. Forrest told us these were scare tactics designed to make us withdraw our testimony. He said it actually helped the investigation because it showed consciousness of guilt. People who were innocent didn't threaten witnesses. We just needed to hold strong and let his team do their work. Easy to say, Much harder to do when you're looking over your shoulder constantly and jumping at every unexpected noise. I started staying on base instead of going home, sleeping and visiting officer quarters where there was security. Leo went to stay with his parents in a different state. Derek hired private security for his bar. We were all in hiding, waiting for the investigation to progress. The breakthrough came 2 months after our initial meeting with Forrest. His team had been quietly interviewing other members of Austin's unit, and they found someone willing to talk. Another soldier who'd been in Austin's platoon agreed to testify once he learned he wasn't the only one. His evidence corroborated everything Austin and Leo had documented. Forrest's team also subpoenaed financial records from Sentinel Defense and discovered a pattern of payments to offshore accounts controlled by Major Griffith. The paper trail was undeniable. Additionally, they found communications between Sentinel's CEO and Griffith discussing Austin as a problem that needed to be solved. The phrase used was permanent solution, which in the context of Austin's death 6 weeks later was damning. With this new evidence, Forrest got authorization to bring criminal charges. Federal agents arrested Griffith at his current posting and seized Sentinel's records. The story broke in the military press and then mainstream media, exposing the corruption scandal. But they still couldn't prove Austin's death was murder. The original investigation had ruled it suicide, and reopening that case required new evidence. Griffith's lawyers argued that while their client might have been involved in financial impropriety, there was no proof he'd killed anyone. Austin's death was a tragedy, but unrelated to the corruption charges. I felt like screaming. We had proof of motive, proof of conspiracy, proof that Griffith had explicitly discussed Austin as a problem, but we couldn't prove the actual murder. Forrest said they were still investigating, looking for whoever had been hired to stage Austin's suicide. These operations usually involved third parties, contractors, or criminals hired to do the actual killing. If they could find that person and flip them into testifying against Griffith, they'd have their murder case. But it would take time and might never happen. I asked if justice for the corruption would have to be enough. Forrest said sometimes that's all we get. The trial started 6 months after our initial meeting in D.C. Major Griffith faced charges of fraud, conspiracy, theft of government property, and accepting bribes. Sentinel Defense Corporation faced corporate charges and massive fines. I sat in the courtroom every day, watching the prosecution present the evidence we'd gathered. Leo testified for 3 hours, describing everything he'd witnessed. Simone provided expert analysis of the documentation. Forrest explained how his investigation had uncovered years of systematic theft and corruption. The defense tried to discredit us, calling us conspiracy theorists and disgruntled veterans with axes to grind. They portrayed Griffith as a dedicated officer being scapegoated by subordinates who'd failed to follow orders. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Griffith was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Sentinel's CEO got 12 years. Other executives and military personnel involved got lesser sentences. It was justice, of a sort. But Austin was still dead, and no one was charged with killing him. I was preparing to leave the courthouse after the sentencing when a man approached me in the hallway. He was unremarkable, middle-aged and forgettable, dressed in a cheap suit. He said his name was Alan Krauss, and he'd been Sentinel's logistics coordinator in Afghanistan. He'd heard I was Austin's brother, and he needed to tell me something. We moved to a quieter corner, and he spoke quickly, nervously checking around us. He said he'd been part of the smuggling operation, but he'd never signed up for murder. When Griffith decided Austin needed to be eliminated, Krauss had been ordered to arrange it. He'd hired a contractor, a former special operations soldier who specialized in making deaths look natural or accidental. This contractor had broken into Austin's apartment and staged the suicide, using drugs to incapacitate Austin before hanging him. Krauss had kept documentation of the arrangement because he'd been paranoid about being set up himself. Now that Griffith was convicted and going to prison, Krauss wanted immunity in exchange for testifying about Austin's murder. I grabbed his arm hard enough to hurt and asked why he'd waited this long, why he'd let us think we'd never get justice for Austin's actual death. Krauss pulled away and said he'd been protecting himself, waiting until Griffith was safely behind bars before exposing his own role. He hadn't cared about Austin or justice. He'd cared about saving his own skin, but now he had leverage and he was willing to use it if the prosecutors would deal. I wanted to hate him completely, but I also knew this was our only chance. I found Forrest immediately and dragged him to where Krauss was waiting. Forrest listened to Krauss's story, his expression hardening. Then he made a call to the lead prosecutor. They worked out a deal over the next 3 hours. Krauss would testify fully and provide all documentation. In exchange, he'd get immunity from murder charges and a reduced sentence on his own corruption charges. It left a bad taste, but it was the only way to prove Austin was murdered. The investigation reopened with new urgency. Krauss led them to the contractor he'd hired, a man named Wayne Delaney. Delaney initially refused to cooperate, but when faced with evidence and the threat of a murder charge, he admitted what he'd done. He described how he'd surveilled Austin for 2 weeks, learning his routines. He'd broken in while Austin was sleeping, injected him with a sedative, and staged the hanging to look like suicide. He'd been paid $50,000 for the job. With Delaney's confession and Krause's documentation, prosecutors finally had enough to charge Griffith with conspiracy to commit murder and felony murder. The new trial took another 6 months. I testified this time, describing Austin as I'd known him, explaining why I'd never believed the suicide story. The defense fought hard, arguing Krause and Delaney were unreliable witnesses trying to reduce their own sentences, but the jury believed them. Griffith was convicted and his prison sentence was extended to life without parole. Standing outside the courthouse after that final verdict, I felt hollowed out. We'd won. We'd gotten justice for Austin. But he was still gone, and no verdict would bring him back. Derek put his hand on my shoulder and said Austin would be proud of what we'd accomplished. Leo nodded agreement, his own eyes red. Simone stood slightly apart, professional even in this moment, but I saw satisfaction in her expression. We'd done something that rarely happened in these cases. We'd taken on a corrupt system and won. We'd made powerful people face consequences. We'd proven that one person's testimony mattered, that Austin's voice couldn't be silenced even after death. I looked up at the courthouse building and thought about my brother making that video, knowing he might die but doing it anyway because truth mattered more than safety. He'd been braver than I'd ever realized, and now his story would be part of the public record, a cautionary tale about corruption and a testament to the importance of whistleblowers. 2 years later, I stood in front of the memorial wall at Fallback, looking at the new plaque Derek had installed. It listed Austin's name, rank, and dates of service, along with the words, "Fallen hero, silenced for speaking truth." Derek had turned the bar into an informal support center for veterans dealing with corruption and retaliation in the military. He'd partnered with Simone to provide free investigative services for service members who needed help. Leo worked there part-time, using his own experience to counsel others. I visited when I could, still active duty but forever changed by everything that happened. The Marine Corps had tried to discipline me for my involvement in the investigation, but public attention made that impossible. Instead, I'd become a reluctant advocate for military whistleblower protection. Austin's case had sparked congressional hearings and new legislation. His death had meant something. And every time I walked into Fallback and saw that plaque with my brother's name, I remembered why fighting for justice mattered, even when the cost was almost unbearable. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.